The land was dry, so dry that the very air seemed suspended, as if time itself had paused before the mystery that hung over that valley. The cracked ground formed deep fissures like ancient scars, silent witnesses to a past of destruction. Ezekiel walked slowly, his steps sinking lightly into the hot dust. With each step, the sound of his sandals scraping against the dry soil echoed like a whisper of bones being stirred, as if the ground itself were trying to tell him a forgotten story. The valley opened before him like an open wound. Everywhere skeletons were scattered, not in an orderly fashion, but thrown with violence, like leaves blown by an invisible storm. Shattered skulls, broken ribs, twisted spines, tibias still intertwined as if, in their death, they had tried to protect something, perhaps a final gesture of faith, fear, or despair. The silence was so absolute it seemed sacred, as if that place were guarded by God himself for a specific moment in time, a moment that had finally arrived. Then the voice of the Lord broke into the prophet's spirit, not as a sound audible to human ears, but as a presence that filled everything: mind, flesh, soul, and could not be ignored. Son of man, can these bones live? Ezekiel remained silent for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. His gaze still wandered over the vast expanse of withered corpses, souls that had been torn from their bodies with violence. He knew that to the eyes of men, this was the end. But he was not there because of men. He stood before the God who creates worlds with words, who shapes universes with his breath. And so, with humility, he answered, "O sovereign Lord, you alone know." And with those words, something invisible stirred. The sky did not change color, but the wind shifted direction. The air seemed to grow denser, as if pregnant with something eternal. "Prophesy to these bones," said the Lord, "and say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord.'" Ezekiel obeyed. He felt seized by a boldness that did not come from himself. The valley listened, the bones listened, creation listened, and then he raised his voice and proclaimed, "This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you, and make flesh come upon you, and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord." The moment those words touched the air, something began to happen. A deep, subterranean, metallic, guttural sound. Bones began to move. First one, then another, then hundreds, thousands. The parts came together as if guided by an invisible, intelligent force. Skulls rolled to spines, femurs connected to hips, arms joined to shoulders. It was as if time were being reversed, as if death were being undone in slow motion before the prophet's eyes. An army of skeletons now stood, lifeless but structured. It was a spectacle of order emerging from chaos, a prelude to the impossible. But something was still missing: life. And God said, "Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live.'" Ezekiel closed his eyes and felt the wind. It was not an ordinary wind. It was charged with presence. It was the same breath that had formed man from dust in the beginning. It was the divine breath that transforms clay into a living soul. The valley was invaded by this wind. It descended like an invisible avalanche. When it reached the bodies, their eyes opened. One by one, lungs began to breathe. The sound of the first breaths was like the sound of the sea, deep, uncontrollable, alive. And then, before the prophet, an army arose. No longer bones, no longer corpses. Men, sons, warriors, survivors, bearers of a testimony that had crossed the valley of death. Ezekiel wept, not from sadness, but from awe and wonder, for he understood. This was not merely a symbolic scene, it was a living promise. The Lord then said, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, 'Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off.' Therefore prophesy and say to them, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel." The weight of those words pierced through time. Ezekiel saw the future. He saw the people scattered among the nations, exiled, disfigured, forgotten. But he also saw the return, the rising, the national, spiritual, eternal resurrection, not by the hands of man, but by the word of God. The promise was of life, and life abundant. But with the promise came a warning. Ezekiel saw other visions. He saw the kings of the nations conspiring. He saw armies forming in the north, in distant lands. He saw the name of Gog, the prince of Magog. He saw Meshech, Tubal, and a coalition of hatred rising against the restored people. The Lord warned him, "I am against you, Gog. I will bring you up, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army." It was the announcement of a final war. But God was not indifferent. Ezekiel saw God himself descending with judgment. Earthquakes, fire, confusion among the enemies. He saw the mountains tremble. He saw the sky open. He saw the glory of the Lord not merely as a concept, but as an overwhelming, just presence. And amid it all, he also saw hope. He saw a new temple, a place where the glory of God would dwell forever. He saw a river flowing from that temple, purifying the salty waters, healing the land, nourishing trees that bore fruit in every season. He saw a transformed people walking in righteousness. He saw the law written not on tablets of stone, but on hearts. He saw the name of the Lord honored among the nations. He saw total restoration, not just of a territory, but of a destiny. Ezekiel stood in the center of the valley. There were no longer bones. There was life. There was no longer silence. There was praise. There was no longer death. There was purpose. And in that moment, he knew that everything he had seen was not an illusion. It was a calling, an eternal cry that crossed generations, saying, "The God who resurrects bones also resurrects destinies." And the valley that seemed to be the end was, in truth, the place where everything would begin again. Time seemed to have bowed before the vision Ezekiel had received, and the valley of dry bones was no longer just a static scene of death. It had now become an altar of divine promise. And in the silence that followed the rebirth of that army, the atmosphere carried a sacred weight, as if the heavens themselves watched in reverence. The prophet stood there motionless, enveloped by a feeling that mingled fear and wonder. The words of the Lord continued to echo in his mind like thunder etched in eternity, opening graves, bringing the people back, pouring spirit over forgotten flesh, restoring the devastated land. Ezekiel was no longer just a witness, but the very channel of a spiritual revolution, and God was not yet finished speaking. New visions began to form before his eyes, images that emerged not as disjointed dreams, but as ordered chapters of a living revelation. Ezekiel saw a vast plain, and in the distance a river flowing from the threshold of a temple. It was no ordinary temple. It was the temple of the promise, not built by human hands, but erected in the spirit, with sacred proportions measured by angels, every detail recorded by heaven itself. The waters flowed from beneath the sanctuary's door on the eastern side, and as they advanced, they became deeper, more powerful, purer. First, waters at the ankles, then at the knees, then at the waist, and then waters that could no longer be crossed on foot, a river of life. The prophet watched as the flow continued its course, healing everything in its path. The waters reached the salty sea and made its waters wholesome. Wherever they passed, death retreated. Where there had been desert, trees now flourished with leaves that healed and fruits that never ceased. Their roots plunged into this invisible river, drawing strength and revelation from the throne. Ezekiel understood. This was a symbol of what was to come, of total restoration, of the Spirit being poured out without measure. It was not just about physical reconstruction, but a complete rebirth, from the temple to the heart, from the earth to the heavens, from exile to communion. The image shifted again, as if the curtains of time opened in another direction. Ezekiel now saw the people walking. They were returning step by step, like children coming home after years of absence. Men and women with hands calloused by captivity, eyes marked by time, but with the spark of hope rekindled. They climbed toward the land promised to them, guided not by maps, but by promises etched in their spirits. Cities in ruins were raised again, walls were rebuilt, fields, once dry, now flourished with the strength of blessing. Yet, with restoration came a warning. Ezekiel had another vision, and in it, he beheld a conspiracy forming among the nations. The north stirred. The land of Magog, with its prince Gog, gathered a terrible confederation. Ancient peoples, long scattered, now united for a dark purpose, to invade the restored land, destroy the gathered people, profane what God had sanctified. The prophet saw armies as numerous as the sand of the sea, armed with shields, spears, horses, chariots. Black banners were raised, alliances sealed with blood, strategies plotted in secret. They came not only with military might, but with spiritual arrogance, believing they could break what God had sealed. But the Lord was not indifferent. With a voice like thunder, he declared, "I am against you, Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal." God himself would take up the war. The battle would not be fought between men, but between the Creator and those who dared to challenge his sovereignty. The prophet saw the consequences of this clash. He saw the earth quake violently. Mountains split, fish in the sea died, the heavens filled with smoke. Fire rained from the skies upon the invaders. Confusion ravaged the enemy camps. Brothers turned against brothers. The weapons forged against Israel turned against their own makers. It was judgment, not for vengeance, but for justice. Ezekiel, with eyes still glistening, saw a scene that marked him deeply. After the conflict, he beheld the battlefield. Corpses lay everywhere, but something sacred hovered over that place. There was no human triumph, but the glory of the Lord had been established. The nations would know the name of God, not just through words, but through undeniable acts. Israel would know that the Lord was its shield, and the nations would recognize that no plan against the eternal would prevail. This was more than war. It was the restoration of identity. It was the rebirth of the covenant. The image of the temple reappeared before the prophet, and now he saw it inhabited, not by dead rituals, but by living worship. The children of Israel entered through its gates with praises, with eyes cleansed of ancient tears, with hearts healed of past pains. Ezekiel saw the high priest clothed in glory, offering sacrifices not out of duty, but out of love. He saw the altar ablaze, trumpets sounding, Levites singing with voices that resounded like sweet thunder. And at the center of it all, the presence. The glory that had once departed now returned in full force, filling the place with a light that did not burn, but purified. It was as if Eden itself had been restored, not in the garden, but in the heart of the covenant. And in this sublime scene, God spoke again to the prophet. "This is the place of my throne, the place for the soles of my feet. Here I will dwell among the children of Israel forever." Ezekiel fell face down, unable to bear the weight of the glory. It was more than a vision. It was the consummation of an eternal purpose. The temple was not just a structure. It was a seal. It was an answer. It was an echo of the beginning meeting the end. The valley of dry bones, which once represented death, now became a symbol of life in its fullness. The promise was not just for those with physical eyes, but for every generation that, even surrounded by destruction, dared to believe that God can restore what was buried. And the prophet, enveloped in the sacred, understood that this revelation was not just for him. It was for every heart that had ever felt dry, exiled, forgotten, disconnected from the promise. It was for every people that had ever cried out for deliverance. It was for the dark days, for the shadowy valleys, for the wars yet to come. Because God had not changed. He still spoke. He still called prophets. He still restored. He still poured out his spirit. He still brought life. Time no longer obeyed the common logic of mortals. For Ezekiel, each vision was like a fold in eternity, where past, present, and future intertwined in the same spiritual fabric. The Valley of Dry Bones was no longer a physical place, but a prophetic reality that mirrored the spiritual condition of a people and, at the same time, the heart of all humanity before its creator. The visions had been clear. God would restore what was destroyed, breathe life where there was death, raise a people where there was only dust. But there was something deeper, something God wanted to reveal beyond national restoration, beyond the temple, beyond the land. The Spirit of the Lord carried him once more, and what he saw was different. It was more intimate. It was more human. It was the heart. He saw ordinary people, not kings, not soldiers, but common men and women, grieving fathers, desperate mothers, confused youths, elders whose eyes carried the weight of generations marked by loss, and each of them carried within them the echo of that valley. Bones not visible on the outside, but aching within. Wounds not physical, but spiritual. And God, with his voice like the sound of many waters, said, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." Ezekiel felt the weight of those words. The promise was not just geographical, but existential. God wanted not only to bring the people back to the land, he wanted to bring them back to himself. The prophet saw calloused hands reaching upward, tears streaming down faces that no longer knew what hope was. He saw knees bending in silence, lips trembling in long-forgotten prayers, and he saw the Spirit of the Lord descend upon them like gentle rain after a long drought. It was not a spectacle. It was restoration. It was reconciliation. It was intimacy. The God who breathes life into bones also breathes life into broken hearts. The God who rebuilds temples also rebuilds families. And the valley, once desolate, now became a symbol of what is impossible to human eyes, but natural to the heart of God. Ezekiel then saw the face of a child. She walked through the rubble of what had been a destroyed city. Her bare feet stepped over stones and memories, but her eyes carried no fear. There was light in them, hope. The child knelt, planted something in the dry ground, and smiled. And in that moment, the sky opened above her, and the rain began to fall. It was as if all creation responded to that small being's gesture, and the prophet understood. The new time would begin with the small, with those who have no voice, with the forgotten, with the humble, because the glory of God is not manifest in palaces, but in the secret, not in golden thrones, but in contrite hearts. And when the small recognize the Lord, the whole earth bows with them. The vision advanced. Now, Ezekiel saw multitudes, peoples of different tongues, diverse faces, clothing that indicated distinct cultures, but they all had something in common. They were thirsty. They walked through deserts, guided not by maps or compasses, but by an inner cry that said, "There is something more." And in the distance, they all saw the same image, the temple, not the physical temple described before, but the symbol of God's presence. And a voice was heard among them, "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters." And those who came were not repelled. They were not judged. They were not discriminated against. They were welcomed. It was as if God himself opened his arms and said, "This was always the plan." The covenant that began with Israel now extends to the nations, because the river that flows from the temple knows no boundaries. It is for all. Ezekiel wept, because he understood that the final glory would be greater than the first. The restoration would not be merely a correction of what was lost, but a surpassing of what was once imagined possible. The new covenant would be sealed not in stones, but in blood, not in burnt offerings, but in surrender. And in that valley, now filled with the memory of life, he heard for the last time the voice of the Eternal. "I myself will be their God, and they will be my people." And in that moment, the prophet was no longer just a man. He was a bridge between heaven and earth, a witness that, even when all seems lost, God has already prepared a way. The light began to fade. The dust of the valley no longer rose with the wind, but settled gently on the fertile ground. The bones that once announced the end were now buried beneath living roots, trees growing as monuments to divine faithfulness. Ezekiel, exhausted but at peace, remained silent. He knew not all would understand. He knew many would mock. He knew the valley would return to being just a dry field in the eyes of those without faith. But he had seen, and those who see with the eyes of the Spirit can no longer pretend blindness. His mission now was to proclaim, to testify, to write, to record every word, every image, every detail, so that in the days to come, when the people were once again without hope, they could remember, God resurrects even what has been buried. And as he left the valley, Ezekiel no longer walked alone. He carried within him an army. He carried within him a temple. He carried within him a promise. Because the secret of the valley of dry bones lies not only in what God did, but in what he continues to do, in every generation, in every heart, in every desert. Because the same Spirit that moved the bones that day still breathes, still heals, still calls, and for those who have ears still asks, can these bones live? Time had passed, and even after the vision ended, something had been deposited in Ezekiel's innermost being that could never be taken away. It was not just the weight of the glory he had seen, nor the unforgettable sound of bones coming together, nor even the image of the river healing the devastated lands. It was the understanding that God not only reveals but shares his pain, his zeal, his burning compassion for a people who persist in forgetting their origin. The prophet walked back, not with complete answers, but with an expanded consciousness. He knew that valley existed within every man. He knew there were dry bones within kings and servants, within priests and women, within all who had buried their hope. He now understood that the vision was not just for Israel, it was for all humanity. Everyone who had ever thought God had fallen silent. Everyone who believed their story had ended before its time. And upon returning from the ecstasy of revelation, the natural world seemed pale compared to the intensity of what he had experienced. The sky, once merely a backdrop, was now a constant testimony to the throne that reigns. The earth, with its dust and ruins, had become sacred ground, touched by eternal words. The people who saw him arrive did not understand the gleam in his eyes, nor the heavy silence that now inhabited his gestures. He had carried the bones of death in his soul and seen God breathe into them the breath of eternity. How could he be the same? How could he speak of trivialities when the heavens had entrusted him with the mysteries of time? Ezekiel knew his mission was far from over. Now he must speak with a firm voice, even if no one listened. He must write with a resolute hand, even if few read. He must stand firm, even if the valleys tried to swallow him again. The memory of complete restoration did not leave his mind. The image of the resplendent temple still burned in his heart. But there was something deeper, more hidden. A secret God had shown him without words. Ezekiel understood that the temple to come, where the Lord would dwell forever, would not be made of stone. It would be formed of people, a living body animated by the same Spirit that resurrected the bones. And he realized that the nations bowing before this temple would not bring physical tributes, but would surrender their hearts. The new covenant would not be bound by geographical borders, but sealed by the blood of a righteous one, a servant, a Messiah who would come not with armies, but with humility, the one who would take upon himself the pain of the world's broken bones and offer himself as a sacrifice, as the center of the final temple. These revelations consumed him from within. Ezekiel could no longer look at his people without seeing in them the outline of what God desired to restore. He saw the hardness of hearts, yet untouched, the silent exiles of the soul, the invisible prisons that the Babylonian captivity could not explain. But he also saw the hidden potential. He saw that even in the ashes of unbelief, there were embers lit by ancient promises. And he knew that once God decides to raise someone, not even the dust of death can stop him. Because it is not about man's ability to respond, but about God's decision to act. The valley transforms only because God chooses to breathe upon it, and the divine breath knows no resistance. Where it passes, even the impossible bows its knees. Ezekiel then climbed to the top of a mountain, where he liked to be alone. There, the wind was stronger, and he could hear himself better, or rather, what remained of himself after being completely emptied in the hands of the Most High. He looked at the horizon and saw Babylon, with its immense towers, its pagan temples, its hanging gardens, its silent arrogance that told the world, "We are eternal." And yet, he knew they were not. He knew no city built on pride endures before the God who raises nations and also brings them down. And there, on that mountain, Ezekiel prayed, but not with elaborate words. He prayed with groans, with eyes, with the weight of what he knew. He cried out for mercy. He cried out for a time when the people would not only return to the land, but to their purpose. A time when the children would be more than inhabitants of Jerusalem, carriers of God's presence. He descended from that mountain with a resolute heart. He knew he would still face mockery, resistance, exhaustion. He knew there would be days when it would seem he was speaking to the wind, but he had learned from the Lord himself that it is in the wind that the Spirit moves. It is in desolation that miracles begin to take shape, and the vision of the valley, which once troubled him, now encouraged him, because if God was capable of reversing such an irredeemable scene, then no soul was beyond the reach of grace. No exile could not be reversed. No pain could not be transfigured. The secret of the valley of dry bones lay not only in what was seen that day, but in the eternal truth that Ezekiel's God still walks through the deserts of history, still speaks to prophets, still calls his children to prophesy, even when everything around seems dead. And so he walked, amid ruins and revelations, between what was and what will be, between the now and the eternal, carrying within him the certainty that the same Spirit that had taken him to the valley, that had filled him with awe, vision, and fire, still breathed, because the story did not end there. In truth, it was only beginning. The silence of that night felt different. It was not the silence of abandonment, nor of death. It was a silence full of meaning, as if the entire universe were breathing more slowly, just to hear the echo of the words Ezekiel carried within him. He knew what he had seen was not merely a sequence of disconnected images, nor allegories meant to be forgotten with time. What had been revealed to him in that valley was the pulsing heart of God himself, who refused to abandon his own, even when they had already abandoned themselves. The dust of that place still clung to his garments, a constant reminder that behind the appearance of desolation, there is sacred ground waiting for life. Ezekiel looked at the stars and saw in them the same promise made to Abraham so many generations before: countless children, countless new beginnings. The God who makes covenants is not a God of partiality. He is the God who remains, who sustains, who guards, who lifts from the dust what all have declared lost. He is the God who transforms valleys of death into testimonies of resurrection. And that night, under a cloudless sky, the prophet understood that every generation, sooner or later, would pass through its own valley of dry bones, that every people, every man, every woman would face the feeling that hope is gone, that the future is buried, that there is nothing left but darkness and silence. But he also understood that every valley is an invitation, a place where logic bends, where human strength dissolves, and where the breath of God begins to act, because it is there, at the limit of humanity, that eternity begins to reveal itself. It is in the depths of the valley that the voice of the Most High is heard saying, "Son of man, prophesy." And all who dare to obey, even trembling, even weak, even without understanding, will see the glory of the God who makes all things new. They will see bones coming together. They will see flesh forming. They will see spirit being poured out. They will see life where there was only death. Time passed, and Ezekiel's words crossed the centuries like flaming arrows. They were read by kings and beggars, by priests and soldiers, by the desperate and the hopeful. The Valley of Dry Bones became a universal symbol of restoration, not just for Israel, but for all who need to believe when there is no longer reason to believe. And the temple he saw in vision, the temple, it is still being built, not with hammers and stones, but with hearts and testimonies. Every restored life, every transformed soul, every tear collected in secret, all of it is part of the divine architecture. The Spirit still breathes. The promise still lives. The same God who revealed himself in that valley continues to call prophets. And the question remains, can these bones live? The answer is no longer just on Ezekiel's lips. It echoes on the lips of all whose lives have been restored. It manifests in every act of faith, in every whispered prayer, in every step toward the light, even when all around is still darkness. And if you've come this far, if you've heard this story, if you've felt the call burning in your chest, then understand, the valley is real, but it is not the end. It is the place where God begins the miracle, where he separates those who still believe, where he awakens those who sleep, where he whispers to dry hearts, I am still here. And the glory to come will be greater than any pain you carry, because the Spirit of the Lord does not fail. He breathes where he wills. He acts as he desires. He raises those who have been discarded. He uses those the world has given up on. And before him, even dry bones become armies. If this message touched you, if this valley spoke to your soul, then don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, like this video, and share it with those who need to remember that God still speaks, still restores, still breathes life over the impossible. And don't forget, binge watch the other videos on the channel, because each one brings a spark that can reignite your faith.